Welcome to another tale of the Southwest Desert. In today's episode, we'll be exploring the notorious exploits of Juan Flores, a horse thief and outlaw who terrorized Southern California in the mid-19th century. His story is one of crime, revenge, murder, and ultimately, justice at the end of a rope. So sit back and join me as we journey back to the wild days of 1857 in Old California. Our story begins on a pleasant January day in 1857. An American named Garnet Hardy was driving his four-horse wagon along the old country road between Los Angeles and San Juan Capistrano. Hardy was proud of his fine horses, with their glossy coats and powerful builds. But he was also constantly anxious, as the area was known to be infested with horse thieves. In fact, just a year prior, this very team had been stolen by a thief who ended up being caught and sentenced to 10 years in San Quentin prison. As Hardy approached the town of San Juan Capistrano, a reputed hideout for several notorious robbers, he had an uneasy feeling. After arriving in the early afternoon, he delivered his load, fed his horses, and went to explore the town. While Hardy was occupied, 4 men, one of them, an apparent stranger, sauntered over to critically examine his fine team of horses. The town streets were deserted as the residents took their afternoon siesta, but the men were observed by at least one pair of bright, curious eyes belonging to a young woman named Margarita. Margarita thought she recognized the young stranger, an attractive native Californian. Feeling a bit piqued when he passed by her open doorway without so much as a glance, she contrived an errand to the town store to get a better look. Throwing a shawl over her head, Margarita headed up the street, casting a quick glance at the men as she passed. With a second look, her suspicion was confirmed. The man was Juan Flores himself. Thank you for joining your desert frontiersman Alan on another Southwest journey. If you enjoy this tale, leave a like or comment. For further desert adventures, hit the subscribe button. Seeing Juan Flores greatly surprised Margarita, as he was supposedly serving a long sentence in San Quentin for horse thievery. Slowly making her way back from the store, she noticed Flores angrily gesticulating and talking in agitated tones, seemingly provoked by the sight of Hardy's horses. Margarita's curiosity was piqued. She silently slipped into an abandoned adobe building next to where the men were conversing in low, serious tones. Pressing her ear to a crack in the wall, what she overheard made her grow faint. The men were plotting to waylay and murder Hardy when he left town and make off with his horses to Sonora. Flores, it seemed, had recently escaped from prison. Recognizing the horses as the same ones he had previously stolen, he now burned for revenge against Hardy for the role he played in sending Flores to jail. As the men moved off and Hardy returned to his wagon, Margarita's first instinct was to rush out and warn the American of the deadly danger awaiting him. But not speaking English and fearing Flores might see her and kill them both, she instead raced to alert her friend Don Juan at his nearby rancho. Hearing Margarita's story, Don Juan rushed into town and discreetly informed Hardy of the plot against his life. That night, a messenger was dispatched under the cover of darkness to alert the Los Angeles sheriff about the escaped convict Flores's whereabouts and his murderous intentions. The very next day, a posse of 5 men, led by Sheriff James Barton, and including Hardy's brother Alfred, set out from Los Angeles to apprehend Flores. Barton, considered a fearless lawman, nonetheless seemed to have a premonition of his impending doom as he took the unusual step of making out his will before embarking. After camping for a night, the posse reached the Sepulveda Rancho around mid-morning, where they were treated to a generous rancho breakfast. The men had brought an assortment of shotguns and revolvers, which they removed and left on the porch while dining, retrieving them before continuing their pursuit. Their group was joined by a Frenchman also traveling south. About 12 miles further along, As Barton and a deputy rode in the lead with Alfred Hardy and the Frenchman trailing behind, a group of 16 horsemen suddenly appeared from behind a hill a few hundred yards off the road. Though not unusual to see vaqueros traveling in a group, Barton halted suspiciously and called for the others to ride up and join him. As the large group approached, Barton's posse prepared to dismount and confront them, but the horsemen claimed to be friends and, appearing unarmed, the lawman remained mounted. Barton recognized Flores among the group, as well as another wanted bandit, Pancho Daniel. He called for them to surrender, but undaunted, the bandits continued riding straight at them. Then, when just a few yards away, the outlaws suddenly produced revolvers and opened fire on the lawman. Barton and his deputies, though expert marksmen, were caught by surprise. Returning fire at close range, they were shocked when none of the outlaws fell, leading to suspicion the bandits had secretly removed the shot from their guns during breakfast. In the furious close-quarters gunfight that followed, Barton and 3 of his deputies were quickly shot from their saddles. The unarmed Frenchman immediately turned and fled, with Alfred Hardy following close behind after his own horse became unmanageable. Clearly outmatched, Hardy and the Frenchman spurred their mounts and raced away, Hardy's speedy horse allowing him to outpace their pursuers. Strangely, the bandits left the Frenchman unharmed. After callously stripping the dead lawmen of valuables and arms, then shooting their prone bodies full of holes, Flores and his gang rode back to San Juan Capistrano, drunkenly celebrating their victory and taking over the town. Hardy, upon returning and seeing what had happened, grabbed his wagon team and fled, taking a long roundabout route through the mountains before finally reaching Los Angeles over a week later with news of the massacre. Hardy's report of the brutal slaying of the sheriff and his men provoked a firestorm of shock and outrage in Los Angeles. When the bullet-riddled bodies were brought back the next day, it seemed the entire populace turned out for their burial, united in their desire for swift retribution against the cowardly killers. Sheriff Barton had been a very popular figure and his loss was deeply felt. Volunteer posses quickly formed, including a large contingent from the nearby town of El Monte, which was known as a bit of a rough frontier settlement. Prominent California rancher Don Pio Pico, himself a former governor, provided mounts for the men. Within 2 days, a force of 50 riders under the command of General Andres Pico set out for San Juan Capistrano. The pursuers spent several days scouring the hills around San Juan Capistrano, eventually splitting into 3 groups, one heading up the coast, one down, and a third made up of Mexicans, Californios, and the El Monte boys striking out for the mountains. It was this third group that caught a break on the 4th or 5th day as they crossed over the ridges between Aliso and Santiago Canyon. As the sun rose that fateful morning, the canyons were still covered in dense brush, largely uninhabited. Pausing on a ridge to get their bearings, the vigilantes heard the sound of voices drifting up from below. Gazing down, they spotted a group of 8 men on horseback riding slowly down the canyon. With whoops and hollers, the posse spurred their mounts and raced down the steep slope to cut off their quarry. Flores and his men responded with curses. Seeing their way blocked, they wheeled around and charged back up the narrow canyon. A few wild shots were exchanged, but amazingly, no one was hit. But the treacherous, rocky terrain of the canyon worked against the fleeing bandits. Coming to a fork, they tried to scramble up the steep middle ridge, only to find themselves trapped at the top of a cliff, with the vengeful posse right behind them and cutting off any escape back down. The jig appeared to be up for the cornered outlaws, but in a desperate ploy, the wily Flores and 2 of his compadres abandoned their horses and scrambled over the sheer drop-off, half climbing, half falling down the cliff face at the risk of their necks. One of their horses, attempting to follow, lost its footing and plunged to its death on the rocks below. The remaining 5 bandits, stalling just long enough for Flores to get away, had no choice but to meekly surrender to the posse. While some of the El Monte men took the captured outlaws to be held at a nearby adobe, the rest continued their dogged pursuit of Flores and the other two escapees. For the rest of that day and into the next, they hounded them through the rugged, brush-choked hills, not letting up for a moment. Finally, in a stroke of luck, a hungry Flores made the mistake of firing his pistol to shoot a rabbit, allowing his pursuers to zero in on the shot. He was captured and taken to join his gang at the adobe. The other two fugitives were also run to ground and apprehended later that same day, not far away as the posse was returning to the valley floor. But just when it seemed the saga was over, a messenger arrived with shocking news. Overnight, Flores had somehow managed to chew through his bonds and untie one of his men, who freed the rest. Overpowering their guards, the bandits had once again escaped into the night. While the others were quickly recaptured, Flores had vanished like a ghost into the darkness, presumably returning to his mountain hideouts. The posse halted to confer amongst themselves and come up with a new plan. It was decided they would have to comb the highest reaches of the mountains to flush out the slippery floors once and for all. The other prisoners would only slow them down. Besides, there was no clear proof tying them directly to the murder of the sheriff and his men. Still, they were known to be gamblers and villains who kept bad company. A short time later, the vigilantes emerged from beneath the trees to continue their pursuit. The captured bandits were no longer with them, however. They had been left to dangle lifelessly from the stout branches of the sycamores, strung up by the angry mob without judge or jury. Unaware of his gang's grim fate, Flores made his way on foot toward Los Angeles. His plan was to secretly enter the city and lay low with friends until the tumult and scrutiny around his crimes eased somewhat. However, upon reaching the outskirts, he found all entry and exit from the city was being tightly controlled and monitored. There was no way in without being spotted and nabbed. Famished and footsore from days in the wild, the fugitive reached out to associates who had helped him in the past, begging for shelter and aid. But word of his deeds had spread, and the dragnet was so tight that none dared assist him, not even with so much as a crust of bread. Demoralized and desperate, Flores slunk off to hide in the Cahuenga Hills on the city's edge. There, a few days later, his luck finally ran out as he was captured by the authorities. The swarthy young bandito's flair for hair's-breadth escapes had finally failed him. A short time later, Flores was unceremoniously hanged for his crimes on the spot where the Grand County Courthouse now stands. He went to the gallows with his head held high. Though admitting his guilt, he claimed Pancho Daniel had actually been the ringleader behind the ambush and murder of Sheriff Barton's posse. He was just 22 years old. In the months that followed, most of Flores' crew were rounded up as well and imprisoned for life or executed. Daniel proved hardest to find, staying on the run for nearly 2 years. But the law caught up to him at last, still wearing a belt taken from the dead Sheriff Barton. One morning, the townspeople awoke to find his body dangling from a beam in front of the Los Angeles jailhouse, strung up by parties unknown as a grim warning and reminder that justice, even belated justice, always prevailed. And so ends the story of Juan Flores, youthful horse thief turned cop killer and public enemy #1. His lightning escape from San Quentin and murderous vendetta against the lawman who put him away culminated in the brutal slayings that became known as the Barton Massacre, one of the deadliest attacks on peace officers in the era. Flores's subsequent flight into the mountains of Orange County, dogged by one of the largest manhunts in the region's history, has embedded many local place names such as Flores Peak on the map to this day. Well, thank you for joining us on another Southwest adventure. Please leave a like or comment. For further desert romps, hit the subscribe button. Happy trails!